The following presentation is brought to you by Perusia Media. Please listen at the end for more information about the many fine products available from Perusia Media.
Thanks, Mel. So tonight's talk, somebody asked me in preparing it, how was it for me personally, spiritually? And I have to say it was deeply nourishing. And so even just as a preface for tonight's talk, that's what I hope it will be for you. It's not meant to be explicitly apologetic, although I think it will serve to help defend and explain the Catholic understanding of Mary. But first and foremost, I hope that it will help us all grow in our appreciation, our devotion, our love for the Blessed Mother. So before becoming Pope Benedict XVI, as Joseph Ratzinger, he wrote that the image of Mary in the New Testament is woven entirely of Old Testament threads. So it's in this spirit that I titled the talk Mary Through Jewish Eyes, because sometimes we think that our Catholic understanding of Mary, even if we're willing to accept it, is something that's like basically foreign to the scriptures. You know, we really had to read a lot into it in order to get Mary assumed into heaven, to get the Immaculate Conception, to get Mary as the great intercessor. But tonight I hope to show that not only is this not the case, but when we see Mary, the figure of Mary as presented in the New Testament, through the eyes of a first century Jewish person, through the eyes of Jewish tradition, and through the eyes of the Old Testament, we see Catholic Mary specifically. We see a Mary that demands to be venerated. We see a Mary that demands to be a part of our spiritual life as we grow closer to her Son. So what I hope that over this evening's presentation, we're going to see Mary as the Mother of God, immaculately conceived, the great intercessor for all mankind, mediatrix for all grace, we'll explain that, and bodily assumed into heaven. All those specifically Catholic details of the Blessed Mother should come forward through a Jewish vision of Mary. So I want to explain in a bit more detail what I mean when I say, viewing Mary through Jewish eyes. Well, I want to present you with the word typology. It's probably something you've come across before. To see Mary through Jewish eyes is to see her through the lens of the Old Testament and other Jewish texts. And to see a New Testament figure through the Old Testament is applying what we call the exegetical tool of typology. So how does this work, or what is this idea of typology? So from the first century, from the New Testament, and even there are examples, I think, in the Old Testament, whenever people read the scriptures, they would read the scriptures in light of the Old Testament. Naturally, we know that the New Testament and God's full revelation in Jesus Christ came to fulfill what was already revealed in the Old Testament. But how they would do this, or a concrete example of this, hermeneutic, was to look in the Old Testament and see people, places, or objects as having a meaning in themselves, but also having a prophetic meaning, pointing to something else to come. One person might point to a future person, one object to a future object, one place to a future place. And it's only in the New Testament with the full revelation of Christ that these types find their fulfillment in reality. A type and a reality. The Greek words that amalgamate to form the word typology is typoi, logos, the study of types. And what a type is the form or pattern according to which a new reality is made. So think about it like this. If you've ever, made cookies or something, and if you want to make a cookie, you've got the dough, but you want your cookie to be shaped like, just say, a star. And so what you need is the star-shaped cookie cutter in order to get that shaped cookie. So think of the star-shaped cookie cutter as a type. It has a meaning and significance in itself, but its full meaning is not meant to terminate in itself. It's pointing to something beyond itself, to the shape of the cookie that it's going to eventually produce. The cookie cutter is the type, the cookie is the reality, and one sheds light on the other. So when we find types, examples of types in the Old Testament, they don't just point to the New Testament realities, but they help to explain it in a deeper way. So this is fundamental to my claim that when we see Mary through Jewish eyes, through the eyes of types, we understand her better, because that's how God has ordained to reveal himself. So just to give you an example of typology in action in the Bible, because this is not something that was invented later in the church. It's something used even by the New Testament itself in various places. So St. Paul, he uses this idea of typology to describe the relationship between Adam and Jesus. So Adam is the type, and Adam points to the reality. Now you might immediately begin to imagine why these two people were linked. Because between a type and a reality, there's always some sort of moral similarity. There's something that connects them. And so what would connect Adam and Christ? Well, you might say both were kind of born directly from God. You might say both have a headship over the human race. Both affected all mankind in a spiritual way. So there's a relationship between them that makes the link reasonable and sensible, and which is why Paul uses it to explain Jesus as the new Adam. Because as he's speaking to Jews, he's trying to explain what kind of person Christ is by pointing back to the type that pointed to Jesus in God's plan of salvation. Jesus is the new Adam because, like Adam, his actions impacted the human race. One took away God's grace, one brought God's grace back in. Now, there's a whole bunch of other examples of typology in the Old Testament, and many of them don't even apply to people. Think of the places. Think of what the city of Jerusalem might point towards. Jerusalem's a place where God lives. Remember, in the temple. Jerusalem is a place where the prophecies prophesied that all peoples will eventually gather under the one name of God. Jerusalem is on a mountain. It's close to the heights, union with God. By being an inhabitant in Jerusalem, I'm close to God on a spiritual level. So of course, Zion or Jerusalem as an earthly city points forward to the heavenly Jerusalem, to heaven itself. And even outside of the New Testament, typology was immediately used by the first Christians. Some of the oldest documents we have in the church are written by Christians, include things like the Didache, or the letter to the shepherd from the shepherd of Hermas, and a letter from St. Clement to the Corinthians. He was an early pope, and we're pretty sure he wrote this letter in the year 97 AD. And in the year 97 AD, he looks back to the figure of Rahab in the Old Testament in the book of Joshua. It's a bit of an obscure story, but she puts out the scarlet handkerchief to indicate to the Jews that, yeah, it's safe to come in and to spare her household. And he says that the red color of the scarlet, which saved the Jewish people, was a type of the blood of Christ that would save us from our sins. So again, it's not something we're just inventing. It was deeply entrenched in the biblical mind, and it's been used in the Christian mind, in the Christian reading of the scriptures from the very beginning. So now, let's begin to apply this technique, seeing Mary through Jewish eyes, using typology, and try to better understand the Mother of God. So where can we start with Mary? Well, best place to start is in the beginning. In fact, one of the richest sources for our theology of Mary, or Mariology, is the book of Genesis. We've heard that St. Paul saw in Adam a type of the reality who is Jesus. Well, already by the 2nd century, Christians were extending that parallel, extending that typology, applying it also to Eve and Mary, calling Mary the new Eve. St. Irenaeus, for example, by the year around, I think it's 180 AD, was already calling Mary the new Eve. The quote's here, I'm not going to read you the long quote, otherwise we'll never finish. But as we'll see, the reason why he called Mary the new Eve is not because he invented it, but because he found indications of this typology, both in the book of Genesis and in the New Testament description of Mary. So when a Jewish person or an early Christian with the, deeply entrenched in Jewish traditions and in the Old Testament reads the Gospels, I'm claiming, and so was St. Irenaeus, that they were seeing Mary being presented as a new Eve. So let's have a look. All right. The first book of the Torah, the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve are created by God. We have 2 accounts of their creation, and I'll draw from elements of both accounts. So at the end of the first account, God looks upon the creation of man and declares it, unlike the first 5 days, he declares the creation that includes man as very good. Tov meod is the Hebrew term. And the Hebrew expression very good, tov meod, has the connotation of being like morally upright, just, righteous before God. So both Adam and Eve are created in a state of friendship with God, without any trace of sin, and they're in this state of friendship with God. All right. So we call Adam's wife Eve, but something that's important to notice, and I didn't realize this until preparing for this talk. I didn't realize a lot of things until preparing for this talk. That we call Adam's wife Eve mainly, right? But the Genesis text only calls her Eve after the commission of original sin. Outside of that, the way she's referred to by the book of Genesis, 11 times to 1, is as Isha, is as woman. So the book of Genesis only calls Eve Eve once. Outside of that, it calls her woman, Isha. Ish is man, and you probably already learnt this, and Isha is from man, woman, kind of works in English. Isha means coming from the man because Eve was created from the side of Christ. So keep these things in mind. Created in a morally upright state. Named woman. What else do we have? Well, the first man and the first woman are intimately bonded together. Okay, in their creation, Eve comes from Adam. In the commission of their sin, both commit the act of disobedience against God through the temptation of the serpent. And even in suffering the effects of sins, all right, both have to endure suffering, death, concupiscence as a result of their fall. So there's a strong unity between the first Adam and the first Eve. But Adam and Eve play a very distinct role in how they committed original sin. And this is something key. I recommend this book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of Mary. I got most of my material from here. But this part, I'm proud to say, is original, I think, to me, or at least I haven't read about it elsewhere. The distinct role that Adam and Eve play in the commission and transmission of original sin. So pay attention to the dynamic of how the fall happens. Who does the devil tempt in the form of Satan? He tempts Eve. Eve receives of the fruit, commits the act of original sin, disobeys God, then takes that sin and proposes it to Adam. So sin enters into the world through the woman to the man. So she's like a mediator between the devil and Adam. All right? Sin passes from her to Adam. But next, according to the way Jewish people understood biology, and this was common in the ancient world, but it took on a religious significance for the Jewish people, the entire world's population was contained within the loins of Adam, because they're understanding that it was only in the man's semen that a whole person is formed. There's no union of sperm and egg in that ancient biology. So people, the whole world is already in Adam's loins. So it's only when he commits the sin that there's a sense of transmission of the sin to other people. He's the only authentic operator of original sin. And that biology was, used through the scholastic period. So you even have people like St. Thomas Aquinas say, if only Eve sinned, we would not inherit the consequence of original sin. Because only Adam has a headship over the human race, and biologically speaking, there needs to be some, for them, material contact between us and Adam. So where was the material contact? We were in his loins. And when he sinned, the sin passes to us. So Adam's the only authentic operator, I'm inventing these words, of original sin. But what's Eve's contribution? She brought the sin to Adam, but Eve is the mother of all the living because through her, new life is born. So if Adam alone sinned, or Eve and Adam sinned, but they never came together and had children, then there would be no original sin because there'd be no human race. So Adam's operation of original sin must pass through the cooperation of Eve in order to be passed on to the descendants of the first man. Without Eve, there's no reproduction. Without Eve, there's no human race. She's the carrier of all life, and therefore all effects of Adam's sin must pass through her if they are to impact humanity. So notice the distinct role. Only one really does it, but it doesn't reach everybody except for the other also. And you can begin to see where this is going. Remember that it was also the serpent who successfully tempted Adam and Eve. Now, the idea of associating the serpent with the devil is not a Christian innovation. There's ancient texts which associate the devil with the serpent. They call him Satan mainly, in ancient Jewish texts. So like one example. It's in the Book of Wisdom. There's one example, and I think I might have included others later on. The Book of Enoch and some other things. The Targum Neophiti, random stuff. All right, so the Jewish people also understand that Satan is to be regarded as an angel of God. So it's the devil, not just the serpent, who tempts Eve and then Adam through Eve. The devil's an angel of God. So it's from an angel that the act of disobedience comes to Eve. And it's the devil who is the subject of a passage that we're going to consider now. So catching Adam and Eve out on their sin, what does God do? He curses Satan, he curses the devil, and then makes this prophecy. You know, we know it as Christians as a proto-evangelium. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. So after cursing the devil, God makes his prophecy about the seed of both the offspring of the woman and the seed of the devil. The devil and his offspring and the woman and her offspring. So how would a Jewish person have understood this passage? All right, we've already seen that a Jewish person associates the devil with the serpent, but who is the seed or the offspring of the woman? Okay, because we know the answer as Christians, but where did that come from? There's a very old Jewish tradition that answers with the figure of the Messiah. He is the offspring of the woman and the one who will bruise the serpent's head. So there's an ancient Jewish commentary on Genesis, I'll quote to you now. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your sons and her sons. For her sons, however, there will be a remedy, but for you, O serpent, there will not be a remedy, since they are to make appeasement in the end, in the day of King Messiah. So the Jewish idea of the Messiah was also associated with the Son of Man, all right? Because in the 1st century AD book, the book of Enoch, the Son of Man is described there as the offspring of the mother of the living, concealed from the beginning. So when Jewish people read this prophecy, they're reading that the devil will contend, or his offspring, with the fruit of the woman who will come in the form of the Messiah, or the Son of Man. So let's just review what we've got from Genesis so far, okay, through these Jewish eyes. The figure of Eve from the book of Genesis is overwhelmingly referred to as woman, Isha rather than Eve. This woman is created very good, speaking to her morally just state. Though Adam's a primary operator of original sin, Eve is a cooperator. Sin comes through her to Adam and from Adam through Eve to all. Within the Jewish and Christian tradition, the serpent's associated with Satan, and Satan is an angel. After the commission of the first sin, God promises that a man shall spring from the woman, and this man, according to Jewish tradition, is the Son of Man or the Messiah. Now, keep there your Jewish glasses, put them on. Now let's turn and read the Gospel of John. All right? So the first thing to note is that how does John begin his Gospel? He begins the Gospel with the very same words that begin the book of Genesis. In the beginning, in the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So immediately, the first message being sent to the reader, which many would have been Jewish initially, is to think back to the book of Genesis. Okay. Now, there's various reasons for this, but I want to focus on just one. Why keep Genesis in mind, says John. The first half of John's Gospel is commonly referred to in a later exegetical tradition as the book of signs. We have miracles, but John called them signs because all of Jesus' miracles were like a signpost pointing to something beyond itself. Raising Lazarus, what's that pointing to? His resurrection and our resurrection, for example. How many signs are there? 7. So a Jewish person reading the Gospel of John is thinking about Genesis, again referred back to Genesis by the number of signs performed by Jesus. 7 signs, 7 days of creation. So perhaps there's a sense of a new creation as well being proposed by John here through Christ. So what does all this have to do with Mary? I haven't even mentioned her yet. Well, St. John in his Gospel mentions Mary twice only. Only twice. Think about it. He's the one who had to take her as his own mother. He's the one who was received by her as her son. And yet he mentions her only twice. And on both occasions, first being, the wedding feast at Cana, and the second being the moment of Christ's death on the cross. Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. On both occasions, Jesus is present, all right? And on both occasions, John has Jesus referring to his mother. And on both occasions, Jesus doesn't call her mum. He doesn't call her Mary. He calls her woman, and only woman. Now, it might seem strange, but never does John have Christ refer to his mother as woman. The other as Mary. The other Gospels do this. John's not doing this. This is not an accident, okay? This is John saying, I'm pointing you in a theological direction here. Pay attention. So let's look at the first mention. How does he describe Mary, or the woman, at the wedding feast at Cana? On the third day, there was a marriage at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus was also invited to the marriage with his disciples. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "O woman, what have you to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." So the first thing, the context is a wedding, but there's no mention of the bride or groom. Again, a theological clue. Forget about the wedding in one sense. Pay attention to Mary and Jesus and the way they interact. The second thing, the passage begins with the words "on the third day." Now, the opening 4 chapters of the book of signs take place over these 7 days. 7 signs actually taking place over 7 days. Not like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but because the other signs actually come after. So the opening 4 chapters of the book of signs take place over 7 days, but the first sign is here at Cana. Now, the first sign takes place on this 7th day. Before the wedding feast, John has 4 scenes take place in the first 4 chapters of his gospel. Scenes 2 to 4 begin with the words, "the next day, the next day, the next day, the next day." 4 times. Then you have this sign at the wedding feast of Cana beginning with the words "on the third day." 1, 2, 3, 4 plus 3 is again 7. The sign performed at Cana takes place on the third day because what happens on the 7th day or within the last 3 days of creation? Man and woman are created. So 7 signs in the gospel, first sign at Cana, and 7 days until the first sign. And specifically, Cana takes place on the third day. All right? It's that sense of including these last 3 days. So by way of brief summary, when reading the Gospel of John, a Jewish person's thinking 3 things. Genesis, new creation, 7 days, and this new creation through Christ. And Adam and Eve, because Adam and Eve are created within the last 3 days of creation. And of course, woman, and we're going to see that here. So going back to the passage, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "O woman, what have you to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Now, we've got to get over this idea that it was rude to address a woman by the title woman, okay? It was actually fairly common in the first century to do so. What was not common was to address your own mother by the title woman. I don't know if it would have been considered rude or not. So in general, you could call a woman woman. That was just perfectly acceptable. It wasn't rude. It wasn't patronizing. But Christ calls his own mother woman, which is deeply unusual. Again, theological significance. The hour of Jesus had not yet come. So this is the hour. What is the hour? It's the hour of his glory, eventual glory on the cross, which is the next time that Mary appears. Twice John speaks of Mary, twice calling her woman. And as we've seen, the word woman or Isha is the preferred title for Eve. So John has a story of Genesis in mind when writing its gospel. It becomes apparent that he's presenting the figure of Mary as the new Eve. And our evidence is more than even the shared title woman. All right, so the word is meant to send back the Jewish reader to Eve, and then you've got the broader context of Genesis. This is some further evidence. Remember the dynamic of how Adam and Eve interacted with original sin. Sin through Eve to Adam, sin from Adam through Eve to all. Go back to Cana. How do Mary and Jesus interact? Mary is the one who brings the request of the servants to Christ. So it's reasonable to believe that she brings their request because they brought their request to her. Servants come to Mary, then Mary goes to Jesus. Now what does Jesus say? He doesn't direct the servants directly, address the servants directly. He directs Mary, who then directs the servants. So it's from the servants through Mary to Jesus, and then from Jesus, he works this operation of his miracle from his grace through Mary to the servants. Do whatever he tells you, says Mary. And again, her response is an act of obedience, undoing the disobedience of Eve. Eve was disobedient to God. Mary calls the servants to obedience to God made flesh. And then and only then does the miracle affect those at the wedding. So there's a little bit of a parallel between the commission and operation of original sin and the commission and operation of this miracle. And we're going to see it applies to salvation at the hour as well. Now think of the more specifically Catholic understanding, the specifically Catholic understanding of Mary. How do we view her? Well, there's various dogmatic points, but one point that's very strong in devotion is to see her as what's called the mediatrix of all grace. So Christ is the only one who gives grace, and he gives grace to the world. But how does he give grace? He gives all grace to the world only through his mother. It's a point in popular Catholic devotion. Grace passes from Christ as from its source and through Mary to us. So in this gospel passage, we're seeing Mary's twofold role as mediatrix. Eve brings the sin to Adam, then brings Adam's sin to the world. Mary brings our prayers to Jesus and then brings the grace of Jesus to the world. But this is a bit of a prelude to the next time John mentions Mary, when the hour takes place, the scene of the crucifixion. So second and last time that she features in his gospel. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw, so he names the others Mary, he can do that twice, but he calls Mary, the mother of Jesus, just the mother of Jesus. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing near, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Woman. Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his home. Keep Genesis in mind here too. On the cross, what happens to Christ's side? It's pierced. Eve is born from the pierced side of Adam. Now, Mary is standing at the side of Jesus on the cross. So there's a sense that she's being born from the side of Christ as a spiritual mother, whereas Eve was born as a natural mother. The piercing of the side of Jesus is only mentioned in the Gospel of John. It's not mentioned in the other Gospels, further reinforcing this theological presentation of Mary as the new Eve. So he's called her woman a bunch of twice. That's enough evidence, but it's the dynamic I want you to pay attention to. How sin versus grace transmits between the two, and also how Mary is born as a mother, a spiritual mother, because who's John? John is us. We're the children of the church. And behold your mother, it's a gift of his mother to us. Another kind of point in Catholic piety or devotion is to understand Mary as a co-redeemer. And this is where people of a Protestant background get very edgy. Okay, because who's the only redeemer? Jesus. But does Mary's cooperation in his redemption attack Christ as, the only true operator of our redemption? No. But how does he work his operation? Jesus is the only redeemer of our salvation, as Adam was the only operator of original sin. To operate it in a sense that he is the source, and if he didn't do it, then we wouldn't be affected. All right, he works his redemption. So let me kind of hone in on that point a little bit more. If Mary had cooperated with God, but Jesus didn't die on the cross, we wouldn't be saved. We wouldn't receive grace. But how does God's grace get to us? As sin had to pass from Adam through Eve to all, so does Christ's salvation, work of salvation, pass through Mary in order to get to us. Remember that the side of Jesus is pierced, and what does the angel Gabriel prophesy for Mary? And your own soul too a sword shall pierce. She's cooperating. She's cooperating. But it has to pass, Christ's redemption passes through her in order to get to us. All right, let's review. Allowing Eve to shed light on Mary, we'll see what we've discovered. The title woman given to Mary and the broader use of language and imagery from Genesis is overwhelming evidence that Mary is being presented as a new Eve. Eve was created very good, we haven't even touched on this point, or in a morally upright state, tov meod. So the reality, to correspond to the type, we would expect to be constituted in holiness also. All right, I'm going to go on that point when we do the Ark of the Covenant in a second. But even there, because Eve is conceived sinless, we also expect Mary to be constituted in a sinless way. 3, the Messiah is associated with the offspring of the woman in Jewish tradition. So a Jewish person, seeing the claim that Christ is the Messiah, would naturally associate Mary with the new Eve. Adam's a primary operator, so too is Jesus a primary operator of our redemption, but as Eve was a true cooperator, so too does Mary truly cooperate in the act of redemption. Christ comes from Mary to the world because he's born from her, and Christ's redemption passes through Mary to we the church as her children. And lastly, Eve was disobedient to God through the intervention of Satan, who is what? An angel. And we didn't again cover this in detail, but how was Mary obedient to God? Through an angel. Good. Let's leave Eve aside for a second. Mary as the Ark of the Covenant. Now remember how I was saying that typology doesn't just apply between persons, but also between objects. It can be like object to person, place to person, person to object, doesn't matter. Most of us might only know about the Ark of the Covenant from the first Indiana Jones movie. That's how I knew, or a documentary about where's the Ark. But the Ark of the Covenant is first and foremost a biblical piece. Okay, after God gives Moses the 10 Commandments, following the Israelite liberation from Egypt, he provides instruction to build an ark to carry the stone tablets upon which the commandments were inscribed. But more importantly, the ark wasn't just a vessel to carry the commandments. The ark was a vessel to carry the presence of God himself. So let's read the relevant excerpts from the book of Exodus. Let them make me a sanctuary. So already he calls the ark a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst. They shall make an ark of acacia wood. Pay attention to that. And you shall overlay it with pure gold. Pay attention to that too. And you shall put into the ark the testimony which I shall give you. Then you shall make a mercy seat. And you shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark. What's a seat for? Someone to sit down, right? Someone to hang out. There I will meet with you. I will speak with you of all that I will give you in commandment for the people of Israel. So essential features to pay attention to. The ark is a sanctuary for the presence of God. Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. God wants to dwell. This ark is the vessel through which he dwells amongst his people. The Jews believed that the presence of God dwelt on the mercy seat and even conversed with them through Moses during the wanderings in the desert. Now we also need to pay attention as to the manner in which God dwelt. How did he dwell on the mercy seat in the ark? What form did he take? Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting. So the ark is brought into the tent of meeting. They kind of go together. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud abode upon it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So how does God make himself present in the tabernacle, in the tent of meeting? In a cloud. Good. God was present in the ark in the form of the glory cloud. The descent of the glory cloud is a key theme all throughout the Old Testament. It's called the kabod, and it's synonymous with the presence of God himself. When the cloud is there, God is there. That's a clear point a Jewish person has in mind. Second, the materials from which the ark needed to be built. And God instructed these materials, all right? It wasn't just that that's how they did it. It was according to the instructions of God. Acacia wood and pure gold. Acacia wood was known in the ancient world for its durability. In fact, the Greek translation of the scriptures, the Septuagint, translates acacia as incorruptible wood. It's a kind of wood that doesn't dissolve, doesn't damage, doesn't corrupt over time. In fact, there's a very famous first century Jewish historian called Josephus. And he describes the ark as made of a wood that was naturally strong and could not be corrupted, without even naming the material. That's the feature. It can't be corrupted. The choice for pure gold is also important. The Hebrew word for pure is tahor, which has a connotation of ritual or moral purity. So the purity of the gold used to make the ark is meant to correspond to the absolute holiness of the ark that's necessary to be a fitting dwelling place for God. It has to be pure gold, not just any gold, pure gold. This is why, as well, human beings were not allowed to touch the Ark of the Covenant. And there's a little quote there of an example when someone does. And it was an accident, still God killed him. I don't. Except by using acacia poles. That was the only way they could carry it. Fast forward in history, the history of the Ark of the Covenant to the time of David. Now, until the reign of King David, from the period of Exodus, the Ark was basically moved around between various temporary dwellings. But in the time of David, what time was it? The time to build a permanent kingdom. The time to bring the ark to a permanent resting place. But it was only David's son Solomon who would finally build the temple. Remember, because David had too much blood on his hands. But who receives the ark? David. David arose, second book of Samuel. David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baale, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. So then, on its way, the guy touches it. He gets killed. Story continues. And David was afraid of the Lord because this guy got killed. And he said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, but David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, and the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months. So David went and brought up the ark of God after hearing that, God blessed his house, from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David. How? With rejoicing. He danced before the Lord with all his might. David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting, King David leaping and dancing for joy. Those details, we're going to come back to them. So for ancient Jews, the arrival of the ark in the city of God, in the city of David, marked the arrival of God himself, and it was memorialized most beautifully in Psalm 132. And Jewish pilgrims would sing Psalm 132 as they ascended to the city of Jerusalem. And what does the psalm say? Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place. So, Lord is moving, you and the ark of your might. For the Lord has chosen Zion, Jerusalem. He has desired it for his habitation. So God is taking up an inhabitants. And then it has God speak. This is my resting place forever. Here will I dwell. Recap. The Ark of the Covenant contains the saving presence of God in the form of a glory cloud. The ark was made of acacia wood and pure gold, signifying incorruptibility and absolute holiness. And Jewish pilgrimage tradition saw the arrival of the ark in the city of David as the beginning of the permanent dwelling of God amongst his people. Now we know that didn't happen, right? It wasn't permanent because David is just a type of someone else who needs to come. But even though later on the temple was destroyed, Solomon's temple, the ark went missing, and the glory cloud of God's presence departed from Jerusalem, Ezekiel 10. What did the sacred Jewish texts think about what would happen next? There were prophecies that the Ark of the Covenant would eventually return. In the second book of Maccabees, which is not unfortunately in most Bibles, it's only in the Catholic scripture, the Catholic canon, but it's important for today's topic. Second book of Maccabees records the prophet Jeremiah hiding the Ark of the Covenant and the tent of meeting, these vessels for God. He hides it in a cave. And people say, where'd you put it? And so what does he respond to them? The prophet says, the place shall be unknown until God gathered his people together again and show his mercy. And then the Lord will disclose these things, and the glory of the Lord in the cloud will appear, as was shown in the case of Moses. So we're in the first century, we're a Jewish person, we're reading the scriptures, and what do we know? Our temple is empty. The Jewish people were keenly aware that their temple was not marked by the presence of the glory cloud of God, but was marked by the absence of the glory cloud of God. And in fact, when the Roman historian Tacitus speaks about the conquest of Jerusalem, these Jews are like shedding their blood to protect the Romans, to keep the Romans out of the temple, to protect the temple. And they're slaying the priests, and they finally want to get into the inner sanctum, thinking there's going to be tons and tons of treasure to loot. And what do they find in there? What does the general Pompey find? Tacitus. The place was empty, and the secret shrine contained nothing, and the Jewish people knew it. The Holy of Holies in the temple was empty. They were awaiting the return of the ark and the glory cloud of God. This prophecy was there, and it was in the air in the first century. With this background to the ark in mind, we're going to turn to a different gospel, to St. Luke's gospel, to two scenes, the Annunciation and the Visitation, which we celebrate on Friday. So after asking how she would conceive a son without knowing man, how does the angel Gabriel respond to Mary? The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. Now, this is where Greek is helpful, because English translations often omit the parallels. The Greek word to describe the overshadowing of the Most High in this Gospel of Luke is episkiazo, which is the same Greek word used in the book of Exodus to describe how the glory cloud overshadows the tent of meeting. It's the same word in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation, which was written, I think, about 100 BC, and was translated. So already at the Annunciation, Mary is being presented as this new dwelling place for God. Okay, but you might say that's a bit of a stretch. Let's keep going to the scene of the Visitation, where the link between Mary and the ark becomes abundantly clear. Just presenting the parts of the text that are relevant. In those days, Mary arose and went with haste to the hill country, to a city of Judah. There she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary, the babe leapt in her womb. And Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit, and she exclaimed with a loud cry, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. Why is this granted to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For behold, when the voice of your greeting came to my ears, the babe in my womb leaped for joy." And Mary remained with her how long? 3 months, and then returned to her home. Did you notice all the parallels between the arrival of the ark in the city of David and the arrival of Mary at the house of Elizabeth? David arose and went. Same words. Mary arose and went. Where? Judah, Judah. David greets the ark with the words, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" Elizabeth greets Mary saying, "Why is it granted to me that the mother of my Lord should come?" David leaped and danced before the ark and greets it with shouting. Elizabeth's baby leaps for joy, and Elizabeth exclaimed with a loud cry. And finally, the ark remained in the house of Obed-Edom for 3 months. Mary remained in Elizabeth's house for 3 months. Luke is clearly associating Mary with the Ark of the Covenant. The prophesied return of the ark and the glory cloud is taking place with Mary carrying Emmanuel, God with us, in her womb. So if a Jewish person's reading this, they're getting it. All right? Because remember, the arrival of the ark in the city of David wasn't just a nothing event. It was an event that they memorialized and sung in pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And it's recorded elsewhere in the scriptures, such as at Psalm 132. So if a Jewish person's seeing in Mary the return of the Ark of the Covenant, what else would they be ready to concede about who this person Mary must be? Well, if the old ark was made of an incorruptible material and of pure gold, signaling absolute holiness, then suddenly the two doctrines, or dogmas rather, of the Assumption and Immaculate Conception should make perfect sense. Firstly, the Assumption, Mary's body was not left to suffer the corruption of the grave. The ark was made of acacia wood, considered incorruptible. Moreover, if Jesus is the presence of God that dwelt in the ark, then we expect the new ark to accompany the presence. So where Jesus is now, the ark should be, Mary should be. And what was the ark? Her soul? Her body. So we expect Mary's body is already in heaven because of this parallel. In fact, the letter to the Hebrews loved this imagery of Christ as a high priest entering into the sanctuary. All right. It even says, just for this more typology, that the old priests serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly sanctuary. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things to come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with human hands, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy place. Where is this temple? It's in heaven. So if Mary in her body contains the presence of God as the new ark, then it makes sense that she should accompany the presence of God as the tabernacle, the place where Jesus has bodily ascended. And to solidify this connection, one last scripture passage. The book of Revelation. Then God's temple in heaven was opened. This is John's vision. God's temple in heaven is opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen with his temple. But what happens one line later? And a great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. People don't often pick up this connection because that first line about the temple and the ark is the last line of chapter 11, and the part about the woman is the beginning of chapter 12. But remember that the gospel writers didn't put in the chapters. That came in the 15th century or so by, biblical scholars and stuff. So don't separate them. They're a single passage. Now this closes off our comparison with Mary as the new ark, bodily assumed into heaven, but it should also bring closure to the Jewish prophecy of the definitive return of the ark, because the new ark is not destined to return to earth. Type reality. The new ark is worldly. The old ark is worldly. The new ark is heavenly. And so it stays in heaven forever. Even the Immaculate Conception. The dogma states that Mary was conceived purely, free from sin, and lived her entire life without stain of sin. The purity of her conception can be seen in relation to Eve, who we know was constituted in a state of moral purity. But what about Mary living the rest of her life without sin? Because that's contained in what we believe about the Immaculate Conception. Conceived without sin, all her life without sin. Consider some of the links made between the material of pure gold used in the Ark of the Covenant and Mary as sinless in the early church. Saint Hippolytus, the 2nd to 3rd century, super early. The Lord was made without sin, made in his human nature of incorruptible wood, that is to say, of the Virgin and the Holy Spirit, overlaid within and without, as it were, by the purest gold of the Word of God. So because Mary is clothed with the Holy Spirit and receives the Son into her, she lives her life without sin as gold is pure. Or Saint Athanasius, O noble Virgin, who is your equal in greatness, O dwelling place of God the Word, O ark of the new covenant, clothed with purity instead of gold. You are the ark in which is found the golden vessel containing the true manna, which is another typology, manna in the desert. That is the flesh in which divinity resides. Now, what we know about a monarchy, how does a monarchy function in the existing monarchies in the world? You have a king, and the king's wife is the queen, right? But in the Israelite monarchy, and remember, God was always, promising a kingdom to be established with a king. In the Israelite monarchy, the queen of the kingdom was not the wife of the king. The queen of the kingdom was the mother of the king. And in fact, there's examples throughout the Old Testament, such as with King David. He marries who? Eventually Bathsheba, the unfortunate adulterous union to begin with, but he marries her. When David's king, how does Bathsheba approach him? The text reads that she prostrates herself before him. She calls him Lord, Adonai, which is, between like God and master. But once her son becomes king, once David dies, when she approaches, there's none of these formalities, and she takes her place at a throne on the right side of Solomon, because she is now the queen. And what do people in the kingdom, when they want something, who did they go to? Like there's an example, I forget his name. He goes to the queen, to Bathsheba, and has her intercede on his behalf to the king. Because she and only she can approach his presence in that way and has the pull. She's considered royalty. She's second in the kingdom, in authority. So who is the new David? Who's the head of the kingdom? Christ. He's not married. His mother is the queen. And in the kingdom, the queen has a great authority, and people would often approach the king through the queen as we approach Christ through the intercession of Mary. So I'll leave it there.
We hope you have enjoyed this presentation brought to you by Perusia Media. Perusia Media is an Australian-based media company bringing you good, wholesome Catholic formation material in DVD, CD, and book formats. Visit our website at www.perusiamedia.com. That's www.perusiamedia.com. Thank you for listening, and may God richly bless you and your family.